A world in balance. Over billions of years, particles had repeatedly fused to create something bigger. Each particle had an energy that ensured that it could find the other particles. The particles didn't have to think about what they were doing, nor what their task was. They just followed the energy that was guiding them. The more often the fusion of the particles changed, the more energy it could get. Through the fusion and constant development of many individual particles, the wonders of our nature, small and large life, came into being. In nature, there was neither good nor bad, only a course and balance that connected all life. As unique as nature was in its various places, so were its creatures. Some of the creatures fed on plants, others had to feed on other creatures for their survival. Each unique, each only able to survive if it was in the right conditions to do so, and each vital to maintain the natural balance. The energy of the living beings kept increasing, and their bodies became stronger. They learned to adapt to nature in the best possible ways. Their energy never stopped to lead them to each other and increased their potential through connection and community to meet the constantly changing demands of survival. No one had to tell them what to do or what their duties were, nor did they have to think about it. They needed neither rules nor laws. They simply followed their energy, their wisdom, just as every particle and every fusion of particles did and had always done. The first humans evolved. They took what they needed to live and gave back what no longer served them, were born, lived, returned to nature, always maintaining the natural balance within themselves and their surroundings. Nature did not require an understanding of its course. All of its living beings could trust that their energy would lead them to the very places where, by fusing with new energy, they could increase their potential and, like everything, continually evolve. Like any living being, humans were in constant motion, their energy knowing when it was time to change or move on to new places. In some of these places, they encountered previously unknown nourishment that gave them new energy, made their bodies stronger and their minds sharper. Their potential increased. Instead of just following their energy, they allowed it to drive them further and further, while at the same time developing an awareness of why they were doing what they were doing. They understood that each life served another in different ways, discovered that each type of plant affected their energy differently, and began to steadily increase their potential through conscious nutrition. They wandered through nature, learning about its rhythm, its gifts, and its pitfalls. They began to imitate its behavior and protective mechanisms. In order to maintain the natural balance, the potential of all other life grew at the same rate, and plants and animals developed new abilities to protect themselves from their new enemies. Human bodies were perfectly created by nature to survive in its environment. Constant movement and energy-giving food made them strong. Their minds developed, and with them the potential to gain more and more insight into the processes of the environment. They began to make tools out of wood and stone, which helped them with their everyday life as well as the survival tasks. And with that, they gave themselves the most precious thing in the world: time. They used it to explore the environment even more closely and understood more and more how they could make use of it. They learned to make fire and that they could protect themselves from natural conditions by processing raw materials, plants, and animals. They lived in harmony, always following their energy. They understood the work they could do and the miracles they could perform. They also developed an awareness of what they needed to survive, so they began to look for places where they could find clean water, new energizing food, and shelter. Maintaining a balance, nature also continued to increase its potential, creating places that possessed strong and unique energy. People no longer had to move around, as the diversity available in these places provided them with everything they needed. In some parts of the world, they lived in hidden places where they were protected from enemies and, always following their energy, maintained and increased the highest states of themselves. They learned to use their energy not only for themselves but also for other living beings, never forgetting that they were not allowed to take more than they could give. First imbalance. In other parts of the world, too, people took advantage of their environment to develop their own potential. In places that gave them everything they needed, they were no longer forced to wander the world. They had found their paradise, the place that could give them the most energy, the place where they could find peace. They too found out that only in full peace and quiet they could reach their highest potential. Their energy was boundless, and so was the wisdom that lay within it. They felt safe. They were home. The people enjoyed the beauty of life, studied the nature of their new home closely, learned which plants gave them the most energy and which supported the natural self-healing powers of their bodies. Some of these plants knew how to protect themselves so well that they were difficult to find, and so, for the first time, people began to walk the same path over and over again. The sun rose and set, the weather changed with the course of nature, children were born and people died. People learned what kind of plants they could use and how to catch the animals found in those places. They no longer perceived the world with an eye for its entity, its course, its balance, but created their own world with the wisdom that their ancestors had given them. They multiplied, and soon the places could no longer offer them the protection they were used to. While the first humans understood that their energy was always striving to take them to new places where they could live in balance and ever increase their potential, their descendants had never wandered. They had never seen the diversity and possibilities the world offered, and therefore had only a limited number of experiences. They had learned how to increase and use their energy, which plants helped them to do so, and at what time of the year certain animals could be found. They had learned that they could combine their energy in a group to catch larger animals and accomplish more difficult tasks. But they had forgotten to trust their energy and to let it guide them. People, however, were inseparably connected to each other and all life, and it was time to move on to new places with new energy. They had always understood that there was a course that seemed to protect them, that always made sure that the sun rose and set again, that sent the wind and new energy, that let nature die and come back to life. People, their ancestors and their ancestors had always lived only in balance, in peace. The people felt the violation of the natural balance in their bodies. This feeling was unknown to them. It was unnatural, and they felt how it caused an imbalance in their energy. Without the experiences of their ancestors, people could not understand how this feeling could arise. They just understood that it was hurting them and preventing them from reaching their highest potential. From that moment on, they did everything they could to avoid that feeling. From that moment on, the desire to control the imbalance determined their lives. Second imbalance. While many people of the old world had considered this moment the beginning of human progress, it actually was the beginning of a cycle in human history that could not be broken for many years. To compensate for the lack of food in the known places, people at first only changed the nature of plants and helped them to reproduce. But due to the progressing changes in nature, the search for animal food sources also became more and more difficult. So they soon began to capture animals and take care of them so they could breed in a controllable environment. By creating their own food sources and through conscious actions, they became more and more unconscious of their energy, their true power. They now perceived the world with their eyes, their ears, their hands, their noses, and their tastes. Although they could perceive many things with the combination of all these senses, there was no chance to create a reliable overall picture of their environment without using their energy. While the perception of a single person was very limited, the different perspectives of several people made a group powerful, more powerful than nature, and they became more and more. People had to spend more and more time maintaining their food sources in order not to run the risk that they would die without care or that other creatures would feed on them. Their only natural enemies were wild animals or unpredictable weather conditions, and they understood better and better how to protect themselves against them. The sun rose and set, the weather changed with the course of nature, children were born, and people died. Without intending, people became more and more estranged from nature, its natural rhythm, and therefore also from their own nature. Instead of understanding the world and its reality, they created truth that changed again and again, but always consisted only of what they knew, consciously perceived, and understood. People learned from the achievements of their ancestors that control and structure were necessary for survival, and they continued to develop the tools needed to do so. They solely relied on the things that they had learned and lost the understanding of their energy. They also unlearned to understand each other, and only when the attraction between people was strong enough, they could still feel the connections to each other. To explain things that could not be understood consciously, and to continue to maintain control of their environment, new ways of communication had to be found, and languages developed in communities. Initially, the coexistence of larger communities that provided for the well-being of all by uniting different knowledge, strength, and abilities led to security and continued progress. People no longer carried out the activities that corresponded to their nature, their energy, and could contribute to the preservation of the natural balance, but divided the work that was necessary for the survival of a community among each other. They taught their children how to live in their truth, and taught them the things they needed to do so. Thereby, they possessed the power to control the uncertainties in their lives and the lives of the community. Progress seemed unstoppable. In order to feed the ever-growing masses of people, ever larger areas had to be created for the cultivation of food and for the construction of shelters. But due to the change of natural conditions, not only people had lost their balance, but also nature itself, and with it all life. Animals that had a great influence of the balance of the surrounding nature, but could become a danger to the community, were driven out or exterminated if they had not already moved to new places by themselves. The lack of natural enemies allowed other animal populations to increase rapidly, that became plagues to the people and in turn had to be controlled by human intervention. The biology of the soil changed, and with it the plants growing in it. But since this change happened really slow, people did not notice. Controllable but simple food, which could give people less and less energy, led to ever greater physical imbalance. Without wisdom and confronted with ever new challenges of survival, the people felt their potential fading. Understanding the impact mistakes could have, how quickly things changed, overwhelmed with the demands of survival, trapped in a life whose uncertainties required constant control, more and more fears developed. They began to look for answers in nature, studying cycles and patterns, but they never saw their own behavior and that it had been the cause of all changes. They were separated from their wisdom, understood the energy of nature as little as the one within. Third imbalance. In search of answers to questions and solutions to problems, some people went on migrations, while the rest of the people made sure that the survival of the community was still ensured. The wanderers did not know what they would find outside their familiar surroundings, so they took supplies, tools, and other useful items with them on their journeys. Without knowing it, they were again following a rhythm that nature had always intended for them. The movement, the isolation, and the silence led the wanderers not only to finding new nourishment and new treasures of nature on their paths, but also made their imbalance decrease and their energy become more powerful. From time to time, they met people who came from other parts of the world and lived differently from the wanderers and their communities. They did not speak the same languages, but it wasn't necessary anyway, as through their increased energy, they could feel the connections between each other again more clearly and understood each other in ways without speaking. Sometimes they walked part of a path together and learned from each other that there was much more to the world than the truth had shown them. They traded food and tools, shared knowledge and community. The wanderers returned not only richer in food and answers, but also with a deeper understanding of the world that was closer to reality than to the truth in which they had lived. They had understood that silence helped them to see the reality behind the truth. They had understood that uncertainty was nothing to be afraid of. Setting out into the unknown had rewarded them with so many gifts. They were able to see connections that had previously been hidden from them, began to rediscover the energy within themselves, and with it, the energy that was inherent in all life. Every living being who knew and followed its energy could feel it boundless within. It helped them to achieve a natural state, an inner and outer balance. Energy was wisdom, and wisdom was energy. If each individual used their skills and strength to the best of their ability, the community of all was strongest. And so the wanderers became the protectors of their communities. They were given the time to experience deep rest, to research their thoughts and feelings, and to experience clarity when decisions needed to be made. Some of them were able to understand through new experiences and deep insights that people themselves had been responsible for the changes in nature. They understood that the people were a part of nature, like any other life, and that a renaturation of the control created was necessary to restore balance in nature and people. But others' eyes found only truth without seeing reality. Fourth imbalance. The protectors, unable to see reality, used their new energy in silence to find solutions to the problems of their communities. Instead of finding the source of all imbalance, problems were dealt with as soon as they arose, using whatever means were available. To make this possible, they created structures that, if each person did the work assigned to them, led to security and progress in the community. Always striving to strike a balance and fulfill their own need for security, people took on the tasks assigned to them. Some members of the communities helped their protectors with their decisions through conversation and the acquisition of knowledge, accompanied them on their migrations, and thereby gained more and more knowledge themselves. They became their advisors, the knowing, and gained almost as much power as the protectors themselves. Other members of the communities were given tasks to maintain the structures and organization of the communities. They were also able to further their knowledge through new experiences and people watching. The remaining people of the communities continued to do what they had always done: create and maintain food sources, make tools and other useful items. Since this work was necessary for the survival of the community, it had to be continued, and the possibility of gaining new experiences became a privilege of the few. The sun rose and set, the weather changed with the course of nature, children were born and people died. People spread out further and further, no longer knowing all the people who lived in their communities. Their truth became more and more limited to their own family, their neighbors, and the people they knew. The protectors discovered that people also followed a natural balance, and that they could use it for their own purposes once they had seen through it. They drew borders and assigned land to people to keep track of their communities. Those who lived on poor soil worked in the fields of others to secure food for themselves and their neighbors. Those who had good soil, the skills to make the best use of it, and were able to do their work, could expect a good harvest and make the contribution to the community demanded by the protectors. Soon the workers felt the first consequences of their inadequate diet and one-sided work. Their bodies became weaker, and the imbalance within them increased, their potential steadily fading. The people who provided structure and order saw how the working people lived and recognized their imbalance due to the loss of time and physical rest. They observed that the greater the imbalance within them, the weaker the people became, and that it changed their feelings and thoughts. However, the power that came with the new knowledge caused their own imbalance to fade and their potential to rise. The protectors also did not want to lose their power, their potential, so they kept the fruits of their migrations for themselves and demanded more and more from the people in return for protecting the communities, putting more and more pressure on them. People had to work harder and harder to meet the demands of the protectors. The protectors themselves sought the peace, found more and more knowledge and truth in it, and discovered which activities or things could give them energy. They learned how to strengthen their energy and increase their potential, striving to reach their highest potential like everything in nature. They created opportunities for a more diverse diet for themselves and built walls around their gardens and grounds, sharing their crops not with the community, but with the few who provided security and order. Where they had equal distribution of knowledge and control of the uncertainties of life had contributed to a healthy society, the understanding of the needs for a true community became more and more lost, as the differences between the various ways of life became more apparent. The protectors kept their power, few became more powerful, but the rest of the people became weaker and weaker. They were afraid of everything they could not understand, and without their wisdom, they only understood what they knew or had been taught. An ever-increasing imbalance arose within them, and they did not know how to control it. Confronted with unprecedented suffering and no way to explain it or change anything in their lives, people felt helplessly at the mercy of events and feared the future. They trusted that the protectors in knowing would use their skills to keep their communities safe, as they always had. However, when people realized that these could offer them neither protection nor solutions to their problems, they began to doubt their power, as well as their own truth. People understood that the more of them that came together, the more powerful they became. They began to share, to unite their limited knowledge in order to understand the greater truth of their lives. They recognized the imbalance that had spread through them and the communities as a result of the predetermined structures and power relations that were supposed to serve their protection. If they could not find wisdom in those who protected and knew, they could not find reasons to justify this imbalance, and they were no longer willing to live their lives according to the will of others. At this point, many communities broke up in various ways, and new communities emerged from them, ready to wander the world to find better places and become more just. In other communities, the protectors and the few found new ways to control people and secure their own power. Fifth imbalance. The first humans had lived in a world with balance and understood its energy. For them, just as for animals or plants, it had not mattered when the passage of time had begun, nor why. Following generations had created a truth in which they alone had inherent control over things and their lives. With suffering came the first questions about the origin and finitude of life, the origin of suffering and everything inexplicable on earth and high up in the sky. The people could feel the power that lived in nature around them and that seemed to control everything as if by an invisible hand. A higher power that could give, sustain and take life. A higher power that could direct people's lives just as they did with animals and plants. Not visible, but always present. Everything was in balance, except the people and their truths. They feared for themselves and their families. They demanded answers, called on those who protected them to use their knowledge and power to explain the suffering and find solutions to it. But the protectors had become the powerful and were no longer those with the most energy and wisdom. They were the ones whose anxiousness had left them knowledge, soil and treasures, and so they used these and the beliefs of the people to maintain their position of power. Through stories of older days, they had understood that they could only secure their own power by giving the people answers to their questions. Many of the powerful declared their own power by the will of this higher power, called to guide the people through difficult times. They went into silence, trying to find clarity, but no human had ever seen or spoken to the higher power and knew how to appease it. Nevertheless, the powerful spoke to their communities, proclaiming to them the demands that had to be met in order not to incur the wrath of the higher power. Demands that would make them, as the chosen ones by the higher power, untouchable. The people observed the events with their knowledge and truth. They understood that a person who had so much power, knowledge and potential had to be chosen by a higher power. Unknowing, trustful and following the constant need to strike balance in themselves and everything, people gratefully accepted the explanations offered to them. When new suffering came upon the people, the powerful declared that the higher power was not satisfied with the people, and that it was due to their behavior only. New demands kept arising for people to live by in order to escape the wrath of the higher power. The more control the powerful exercised over their communities, the more they could feel their own power and how it grew and grew. They were able to hold people accountable for their lives and take some of the burdens off their own shoulders. But since people could not find the cause of the imbalance in themselves and in nature, all the sacrifices or ceremonies in the world, all the prayer and all the good deeds could not prevent the suffering. If they were no longer willing to accept the injustice that was happening in their eyes, they were silenced by threats or violence in the name of the powerful, called by a higher power, or accused and sentenced in front of the community as causes of the suffering. Life made people more and more anxious, weaker, and caused an ever-increasing imbalance until they could no longer feel their energy at all. Even the powerful had tried again and again to establish a lasting balance within themselves, but without wisdom, they could never find it. Consciously controlling people for their own needs, directing their own species, their thoughts and feelings were such unnatural acts that the imbalance in the powerful even threatened to become infinite. They lived more and more isolated from their communities, so that they did not have to see or hear their suffering. They had experienced the pleasures that beauty, distraction, and play could offer them. They had figured out that these calmed their thoughts and minds, and feelings of happiness had taken the place of worrying. They accumulated abundance over generations, made their communities work harder and harder to enrich themselves, while the lives of the people became more difficult and less joyful. But the longer the powerful did not see the abuses with their own eyes, and the structures were maintained by the guards they appointed, the more alien the thoughts of the people's suffering became to them. When people recognized the self-interest in it, it was often too late already, and the powerful were not afraid to transform tools into weapons to keep their position of power. The powerful. Some people were appointed protectors, others gods. The powerful drew borders within communities, and everything was assigned a value. The value of the land people had lived on for generations, the value of the work a person could do, even the value of a life they rarely determined based on ability rather than origin. They created relationships of dependency that made it almost impossible to act on one's deepest needs. People lived in daily concern for their survival and that of their neighbors, seeing the challenges of life that seemed to make the powerful and the few even more powerful, yet made the weakest even weaker. They were starving, developing new diseases from the poor food and constant worry, diseases that were also changing and growing stronger. When these diseases spread so far that even the powerful and the few in their remote places of peace began to fear them, they instructed the people with the greatest knowledge to find ways of curing them. People long ago had stopped to understand that the natural balance connected only energy, which, when connected, led to a higher potential. They could not understand, for they had never lived in balance. The knowing began to mix plants together and forced them by their actions to form unnatural connections. Over time, they developed the first cures that could soothe or fight physical symptoms of a disease. The successes brought hope to the people, but cure wasn't free of charge, and so the imbalance of power and dependency continued to grow. People were hopeless, weak, and sick. They feared the wrath of the powerful as well as that of the higher power. Their lives consisted of what they needed to survive, and often there wasn't enough of that either. In their powerlessness, they began to do more and more things that were against their nature. They lied to protect themselves and cheated to gain an advantage, stole from their neighbors, betrayed their loved ones, murdered for food and medicine. Their unnatural acts caused their imbalance to grow ever greater. If people could no longer bear it, they suppressed it to places where it could silently and secretly cause ever greater and more dangerous diseases. The cures had to constantly be developed and strengthened. People who dedicated themselves to healing others with the ancient wisdom of nature were suppressed, persecuted, and not infrequently even had to pay for it with their lives. In the meantime, entire research centers were created in which the knowing combined their knowledge and searched for new healing possibilities. They began to explore the plants and their parts more and more, and when they reached their limits, they even began to include animals and humans in their research. They tested the effects of their research on them, and if they still couldn't find a solution, they even began to research single parts of humans and animals. However, the cures and methods they developed did not just combat symptoms, but affected people's entire biology. If one disease could be cured, another arose. Where human excrements had always served nature as fertilizer, they now became toxic and dangerous, and in turn made new diseases possible. The knowing had to dig deeper and deeper in nature to be able to explore it and find solutions to the problems of their time. The longer they researched and the greater the amount of ancient knowledge they could rely on became, the greater successes could be achieved. They gained deep insights into the natural processes that took place in everything that lived and seemed to follow very specific rhythms. It wasn't uncommon that a discovery happened by pure chance. Understanding the potential of the new discoveries, the powerful used them for their own purposes. They ordered the development of weapons that they could use as a means of pressure or for their own protection. The knowing understood what it could mean if they did not give the powerful what they wanted, and so they did as they were told. The more useful knowing were, the more they were in the favor of the powerful, could save themselves and their loved ones from the life they saw on the streets of the communities. But the more they created, the more powerful the powerful became, and soon the power they already possessed was no longer enough for them. The people who were strong enough to fight had to go out into the world for the powerful, conquering new grounds and bringing foreign treasures. If they refused, they lost honor or life. The battles cost many people their lives, their loved ones, their bodies, their hope, their joy, and much more. They left scars in people that could not be seen with the naked eye, and that not only had an effect on them, their thoughts and feelings, but also on the coexistence of all life. Meanwhile, the powerful continued to draw their borders, and every person within those borders had to live by their rules. The people who had had enough of suffering and pain, who felt weak and just wanted to experience security, accepted the rules. Others fled, but if they could be caught, they were threatened with worse than anything they had ever experienced. Communities became empires. Empires fell and became scattered communities, which in time became new empires. The cycle began and ended, again and again. The Wanderers. Time and time again, people were born who could feel their energies so clearly that it was difficult for them to fit into the given structures. They questioned the rules their parents followed to protect themselves from the wrath of a powerful or higher power, and though they were always silenced, they did not allow their thoughts to be bent. If they were no longer willing to accept the truths that their lives were forcing upon them, they set off on their own paths, new paths, fiercely determined to find reality. The migrations strengthened their bodies, and the beauty of different landscapes cleansed their minds. Like the wanderers before them, they discovered new plants and foods that increased their energy and relearned the value of diversity that had been lost to most people in their communities. They experienced what the world had to offer and did not understand how people could live by rules that made no sense in their eyes. Following their energy, they met new people, experienced kindness and hospitality, and that faith could strengthen the balance in others, instead of making their fears ever greater and more debilitating. Like the wanderers before them, they met people who could give them new perspectives at the world and help them find wisdom behind truth. People who shared their knowledge with them in order to help them find their energy and potential. The more they understood, the more clearly they could see what different kinds of injustice people had committed. The stronger their bodies became and the clearer their thoughts, the more peaceful and happier they became. The freer they felt, the stronger their energy became and the weaker the imbalance within them. The longer they followed their energy, the more experiences they gained that brought them closer to wisdom. If they managed to free themselves from all the thoughts and feelings they had collected previous to their migrations, they found wisdom and peace. They realized that they had been living their lives by perverse rules and worshipping false powers. They realized that the life most people were living was taking their hopes, joy, happiness and dreams, and was weakening them the longer they did not break out of it. They recognized that every life, whether human, animal or plant, was valuable and vital for a natural balance. They realized that only peace was the purpose of all life. Peace and freedom. The wise wandered the world to share their wisdom with the people and to create a better, righteous world together with them. If their words met open hearts, they even found allies in those who went with them, and that then helped them to bring calm and mindfulness, trust and peace to the people. They brought hope to the people and used their energy and wisdom to take away worries and pain. But with their words and actions, they angered the powerful, as they neither wanted the people to know about their injustices, nor were they willing to give up their power. The powerful established new rules and prohibited people to speak about the wise and their words. The mere thought of the consequences should people disobey these rules was unbearable to them. In order not to endanger their lives, most of them stopped talking to each other, kept their thoughts and feelings to themselves, trusted no one. The imbalance within them grew stronger and stronger. Frequently, the wise were persecuted, publicly outlawed, and murdered. And with them, people's hopes for a better life. The few who escaped the catches of the powerful created new communities, striving to build a life in peace and a healthy community in harmony with nature. The sun rose and set, the weather changed with the course of nature, children were born and people died. The more time passed, the more the traditions from old days changed. New, higher powers were born and offered, again, new possibilities to exercise power over others. The seemingly endless cycle started all over again. Old world. The more time passed, the more borders were drawn on the world. Borders ran between communities, within communities, even between families, and determined people's different truths. Children were born and grew up in a world where their worth was measured by the work they could do. Instead of discovering the world, experiencing its beauty, being guided by their energy and gradually developing their abilities and strength, they learned from their parents to live in constant fear of the future. They were prepared to become functioning members of their communities, and when they were old or strong enough, their teaching began. Those who did not contribute to the community or even try to enlarge their truth and that of others fell from grace of the powerful and had to fear for everything they owned. The knowledge and truth of the people was determined by the powerful, and they did everything not to change that. If the injustices became too great and, yet again, turmoil arose in the communities, new routes were created, charitable acts were performed to calm the spirits, or culprits were sought, by which the anger of the people was taken away from the powerful and towards new enemy images. The knowledge that the powerful had collected, increased, and kept to themselves for generations made them always find new ways to maintain control over the people. For generations, the people, on the other hand, had seen and felt the injustices of the world, and so the temptation was great to simply keep the power once they had gained it, just like the powerful, to themselves. While the powerful did not evolve, always making the same mistakes, and people's bodies and spirits became weaker and weaker, research continued to evolve. Discoveries led to progress, which evolved into tools and weapons, which in turn created new opportunities for discovery and weapons, leading to other progress. The cycle did not change over time. It gathered speed only. With each circulation, the world became less righteous and the imbalance greater. Just before the end of the old world, everything happened faster and faster. People adjusted to a life of work and worries, and were content with celebrating and truly enjoying life's greater moments with those closest to them. All over the world, fewer and fewer people could feel their energy and lived by the truth that were made up of what they knew, heard, and could discover for themselves. The human being, who had evolved over thousands of years into this beautiful creature with endless abilities, strength, and great energy, regressed more and more. The beginning of the end before the beginning. The world seemed to be in ruins. After decades in which progress had been accelerated on and on, in which consumption and abundance had been both a status symbol and a death sentence, and time or knowledge were still luxuries of the few, nature was no longer able to maintain a balance. Global warming, natural disasters, resulting famine, extinction of species, exploitation, wars fought out of fear and megalomania. In some parts of the world, the powerful and the knowing intervened even deeper in nature in order to satisfy the desires of the few and to keep their minds quiet. But they had never enough. The powerful continued their raids, taking the treasures of the earth as if they were their own. For a long time they had been imitating not only nature, but animals and humans themselves. They used technology and knowledge to predict people's behavior and best use it for their purposes. People in other parts of the world who had always preserved their energy and wisdom were murdered, enslaved, robbed of their culture, and ancient treasures of human knowledge went irretrievably lost. People felt powerless, overwhelmed by a wide variety of feelings. The world housed weapons that could destroy entire continents, even the world itself. They were afraid for their lives and the beauty in them, afraid to lose the little freedom they could afford through their hard work. They mourned the losses that they had seen with their own eyes, that they had experienced personally. They were upset by the injustices they faced, and in moments of weakness, committed against others. They were frustrated by the powerful who could no longer claim to be the protectors of the people, who, despite their knowledge and warnings from the knowing, clung to a path that created benefits for the few, but brought unspeakable consequences for the rest of humanity, nature, and all its lives. Money ruled the old world, and not only the powerful did everything to get it. In a world where money was needed to survive, that was not incomprehensible. The richer countries of this world did everything to become even richer and to keep this wealth in their country and in their own homes. The poorer countries of the world bore the consequences. While work became increasingly poorly paid all over the world, the cost of healthy food, healthcare, and housing rose. All over the world, most people worked under harsh conditions to survive somehow. Pressure, manipulation, fear and violence glorified lives. The sun rose and set. The weather changed with the course of nature. Children were born and people died. People died in earthquakes. People died of malnutrition. People died in wars that only served the powerful and few. People died from a wide variety of diseases. People died inside. Nature, which had provided a healthy world for thousands of years, died to give way to housing for the powerful and the few who could no longer bear to witness the injustices. Injustices they participated in or didn't change. Not every human was worthless, but most people had learned earlier than later to adapt to the world and its truths. The loss of connection to one's own energy was experienced differently by each human, and there were people who lost their way on the paths of life to such an extent that they did not realize what they had done until they were very old. Some never understood, died lonely and with coldness in their hearts. They had closed their eyes to reality. They had feared death. They had not learned how to find and use their energy. Instead, they had learned how to function in energy-draining structures and how to get the best out of them for themselves and those closest to them. They had learned that they could block out thoughts that made them uncomfortable by distracting their minds. And the old world had many distractions to offer. The world was a merciless place, and like on a sinking ship, everyone was trying to save themselves. At least, that's what they used to say in the old world. The end of the end before the beginning. Through the possibilities of communication and an almost worldwide unlimited access to knowledge, a deeper understanding of the world returned to many places and people. More and more people could no longer silently bear the injustices. They took the time to explore their innermost selves and understood that a healthy nature, mental balance, and physical strength were important factors for a healthy life, which could restore balance to a person's energy. They understood that there was only one path for the future of humanity, and that this path began and ended with each individual. Many wanted to find themselves, but not all were ready to really search for themselves. Very few people cared why they were the way they were, why they did what they did, or why they felt what they felt. Most were unaware of their limitations and perceived them as normal, as they were accepted or common in their communities. They didn't want to worry about injustice, as it meant that they had to look at the injustices of their own lives from other perspectives or change their lives for good. They convinced themselves that their truth was the only truth there was, were not willing to gain new experiences or to seek wisdom behind the truth. They shut their eyes, surrounded themselves with people who shared the same truths, that in the end they forgot what was happening outside their own world. But those who understood the cost of a life in this world were willing to remember over and over again to follow the path to their innermost self. They were the last wanderers of the old world. The wanderers were ready to figure out their limitations and to find the place they were born. They were ready to face the pain that came with all the memories of the defining moments of their lives. People had witnessed their parents living their lives according to old habits and justifications that they were not willing to question. They had seen grief, fear, and pain eat its way into the hearts of people for generations. They had seen how false beliefs were planted in their minds to keep them from questioning the world and its truth. They had felt how much it was affecting their lives, and they were ready for change. Instead of looking for culprits and blaming them for their actions, they were ready to find deeper answers. If they followed the path, they had to walk on their own. Needless to say that they could change ideas with other people or get help from them. But no one could walk beside them on their path. No one could open their eyes for them. Oftentimes, the beginning of the path was full of dangers. The longer the wanderers delayed their start, the further they were from light, warmth, safety, and the darker, colder, and more frightening the beginning turned out to be. Some aborted their journey after only a short amount of time, accepted limitations within themselves that they were not ready to tear down, and returned to normal life. Others were fiercely determined to follow their energy. They wandered through the darkness, braving the cold with thoughts of love and happiness, enduring the pain that could not be worse than the pain they so often felt. Some paths were dangerous, for the pain that lurked there could drive people mad. When their way parted, they rested for a while to see which way was right for them. The wanderers who defied all threats and followed their path to its end found the wisdom behind the truth. They understood what they had done to survive in the old world. They understood that they had repressed memories. They understood that they had been hurt, manipulated, or abused. They understood that they had taken dark paths out of fear of pain. Understood that they had closed their eyes to reality and lied to themselves. Once they understood these things, there was no going back. The wanderers, seeing the faults of the world and understanding the pain that it caused them and countless others, choose love. They decided to share their experiences and provide support to other people searching for themselves. They decided to fight for a better world at the tables of their homes, on the streets, in lecture halls, through art, in public and private. They had understood that they could never live a truly happy life until all life followed its natural course. If they lived in an environment that was too harmful to them, they broke out of it and moved their lives into conditions that were less hostile to them. Some traveled halfway around the world to do so. Others broke off certain contacts. They all found ways to love themselves and others more. Sometimes their actions stirred up their old environment in such a way that even more people started on their path to themselves. Sometimes the old environment had to be left behind in order to experience real peace. They tore down old limitations, and their calls for change grew louder and louder. They wanted to live and be happy. They took to the streets, demanding accountability from the powerful, and tried to open the eyes of the few. but they ignored their shouts, protests, and tears. Still, they did not let themselves be stopped, sharing their knowledge and insights with everyone who was asking. They wrote books, composed music, created films, documentaries, and artwork of all kinds with the same message: that people needed to reconnect with themselves, with others, and the world. That the world needed light instead of darkness. That a world of love and peace was possible. But artists have been ridiculed as dreamers for hundreds of years when they tried to create a better world. Still, they continued to create art in which people could lose and find themselves, which helped people to engage with their inner world and to feel less lonely. But no matter how hard they tried, how strongly they longed for change, and no matter how people shared their message, the powerful and the few would not give up on the world they had created. The Wanderers started companies in which healthy and sustainable solutions were found for the most diverse problem of modern times. But if these threatened to take some of the power from the powerful, unhealthy solutions were given preferential treatment instead of them being banned. Still, the Wanderers did not let anyone stop them from defending the deeper message of their work over and over again. They changed their way of life, paying attention to their diet and their impact on the environment and nature. But laws were made in favor of the powerful and the few. It was almost impossible for people to tell what was healthy and what was harmful to their health. Still, the Wanderers made their lives more environmental friendly, found new access to nature and its gifts. They learned from ancient wisdom, but were surrounded by people who did not understand or ignored it consciously. And then the day had come. The day we would find our home. We had felt the change and yet had no idea what to expect. The dream. The dream that all people dreamt that night was the same and yet as different as the people were. My dream began in my childhood home. I could see the garden, a sea of green with colorful patches bordering fields and a forest. Summer was slowly beginning to show its face, but the air was fresh and full of different aromas. They were the scents of my childhood, my carefree years in this world. It suddenly got dark and cold. I was no longer in my warm home, but in the place where I had first experienced what injustice meant. I knew I could try to run from it, but I forced myself to pull the details of the moment from my memory. A feeling flooded into my body, made it tense, tremble and feel pain. But beside the darkness and the cold, I could feel my energy strong inside me, and I wasn't ready to give up. There was no one here but me, and so I couldn't be judged or condemned. I started looking for memories that had caused the same reactions in my mind and body, trying to identify the feeling as accurately as possible to not confuse it with similar feelings. It seemed like my body had a memory for every single one of my feelings of an infinite emotional world. As if I was following a light through the dark, it showed me all the moments that had led to developing this feeling inside me. To say it was fascinating was still an understatement. I understood that some of my traits had developed from childhood experiences, and that these had led me to making choices that had taken me further and further away from my potential. I understood where my negative thought processes, my rough edges had originated, and that they were not a natural part of me. I understood that these things did not make me unique, but limited, and that they had prevented me from living a truly happy life. Not one with moments of happiness experienced from time to time, but one with deep satisfaction, peace in thoughts and feelings, a strong but controllable energy. I managed to explore new feelings that I had noticed in other moments, and if they had affected my inner balance, I searched for their roots and exhaled them. If they helped me to increase my energy, to heal old wounds, or to evoke positive emotions in other people, I stored them in every cell of my body. The better I understood myself, the better I could understand that every other person carried a no less complex composition of memories, feelings, self-created constructs of lives, and seemingly uncontrollable reactions of body and mind. Looking around, I discovered that I was no longer alone, but surrounded by many people. Some of them I recognized. I saw my mother's eyes become her face and her body. We were back in the garden of my parents' house. I saw the love lines around her eyes and a warm but piercing glance. I loved my mother, and as a child had always been certain that she would protect me from all the pain and suffering in the world. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were no longer warm but glazed, and on closer inspection I could see that she, too, was as human as I was. She too had closed her eyes to things that scared her. She had closed them so she could survive in the world. She too had lived in her own truth and had made sure that her loved ones were safe. She too had lied to herself. I felt her limitations so clearly, they felt like they were my own. She too had understood how unjust our world was. So I walked up to her and rubbed my arms around her. I caressed her head like she had mine when I was a child, kissed her cheek, and caught a breath of her scent that turned into a feeling of endless peace flowing into every cell of my body. My mother's body, which I still held tightly, began to relax, and then she escaped my arms. I wanted to look for her, wanted to scream, wanted to cry and go back to her, but I couldn't. I recalled memories involving my mother that I usually preferred to avoid. But this time I wasn't the ignorant child. I could understand her actions and feelings and understood where their roots had been. I understood what events in our lives had led us to look at the world in different ways and live in different truths. Then I wanted to remember the most horrible moments of my life, wanted to feel the fear, the anger, the despair. But as much as I tried to evoke them, I felt peace only, balance. Some things can't be explained, and you just have to accept them, darling. I was back in the garden of my parents' house, and my father was sitting on a bench, looking younger than the last time I saw him. His eyes sparkled, and he smiled his mischievous smile that had sweetened up my life so many times. He was also more human than I remembered him. People have been trying to figure out what happens after death or why they live since the beginning of time, but they still haven't found an answer. And isn't it even more beautiful not to know everything, when we just let ourselves flow and trust that we are meant to live without knowing exactly why? I closed my eyes, took in his scent, and as I opened them again, he was already walking through the sun in the far distance. I lay down on the grass and let the sun shine on my face. This had been the place where I had grown up. Here I had gained a lot of experience and spent a lot of time alone. Here I had made personal progress as well as regress. My heart started racing, and suddenly everything became such a blur that I had to close my eyes to keep myself from getting dizzy. As if in a daydream, the people who had caused me suffering in the course of my life ran past me in my mind's eye. I could see all of them clearly and realized that I, in years, hadn't thought about some of them or what injustices they had committed. My stomach seemed to turn. I got a headache and felt more and more parts of my body tense up. As soon as I tried to open my eyes, I felt such a pressure that I closed them straight away and saw the faces again. I tried to focus on the feelings in my body and control them, but the more I thought about it, the more the pain grew. Peace. I recalled the feeling of peace I had felt with my parents just a moment before. I focused on how that peace had felt in my body and its cells, used it as an anchor. Then I took a deep breath, focused on the people in my mind's eye, and exhaled for a long time. The exhalation lasted as long as I needed to look closely at every single person I saw, and when I did, I saw that they too had only been human. That they had been causes of pain because they had been unable to find purpose in their own pain. They were like my mother, my father, me. They were not to blame for being the way they were. They were not to blame for losing the connection with themselves so much that they could neither feel nor understand themselves or others. They were not to blame for not understanding the impacts of their actions either. They were not to blame for the world selling them truth as reality. Peace returned into my body. I still looked at each person that appeared to me, and only let go of them when I was sure I could let them go and the pain attached to the memory for good. By the time they had all left, I was no longer dizzy, and when I opened my eyes, I could see clearly again. I looked at my partner, who first let his gaze wander over the fields, the rows of trees, bushes and flowers, before he looked at me lovingly. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We both felt peace, and our connection allowed us to communicate in ways where words weren't sufficient anyway. After a while, we got up and wandered through alleys that had never existed in this place before. We saw many people who, like us, seemed perfectly at peace. Whenever I found their gaze, they couldn't hide anything from me, but they didn't have to anyway. Some were talking, others were laughing. We could clearly sense the energy building from the gathering of so many people. And so we walked on, looking at the people on the streets, enjoying the beauty that was everywhere, exchanging smiles and joy. In my mind's eye, the world in which I wanted to live was created. The world in which my future children should live, in which all people should live. And suddenly, I could see very clearly. All my life I had thought that a person's personality developed through their environment and the people they met on their ways. That we became the people we were through experiences. But the exact opposite was the case. Personality was what remained of a human's inner self when fears, beliefs, or so-called knowledge had limited it further and further. The less we understood where our personality was rooted, the less we could understand ourselves or our reactions and move away from them. The less we understood each other, the more uncontrollable our energy was. And only if we understood and controlled our energy, we could live a truly happy life. New world. When we woke up the next morning, we were able to look at the world with new eyes, and we saw the injustices and abuses very clearly. Not every person had found their way into the new world. Many people had disappeared, but their bodies were nowhere to be found. Soon, news of their disappearance spread, and the first began to assume how it could have happened. Some suspected that a higher power had judged humankind. Others believed that the way to the new world had been hidden from the people whose wounds from the old world had been too deep. But what every single one of us knew for certain was that we did not know who had been the judge, whether there had been a judge at all. It didn't matter anyway. We had all dreamt the same dream. We had understood that yesterday had passed, would never return, and great tasks lay ahead of us that had yet to be accomplished. This exceptional situation could have led to violence, plunder, fear, greed, suffering, and much more. But we were no longer living in the old world. This was the beginning of a new world. We didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, didn't want to follow their beaten tracks. We wanted to live in the here and now, for ourselves and for all those who would come after us. Digital networking, often considered a vice of the young or a security risk in the old world, turned out to be the greatest tool humanity had ever seen. Work was considered a bad thing in the old world, but since the dream of the new world, we saw it as an opportunity to finally give back again. Most jobs of the old world had lost their meaning in the new world, and so the people returned to their true natures. They used their strength and skills for the good of all, where they were needed. Some children had come to the new world without their parents and needed communities to care for them until they were able to do so themselves. So, if life and balance were to be the focus of all action in the new world, the needs necessary for a healthy life in body, mind, and energy had to be met. Oxygen was not only needed for the survival of our bodies. Breathing techniques have been an integral and important part of many therapies and healing processes. They could be used to calm down in stressful conditions, to activate concentration skills, and in many other situations. Due to the prevailing air pollution, harmful gases and a large number of fine dirt particles were able to enter the human bodies with every breath and had caused diseases. However, the air pollution had not only affected people, but also nature and animals. It had led to polluted rainfall, which in turn had an impact on health, water, soil, and plants. Microorganisms and plants that had provided a balanced and healthy biology in water had been damaged or killed, and rivers that had provided people with drinking water for generations had become harmful traps. Soils that had always produced a good harvest had become infertile, and plants had developed diseases. In other countries, wars had destroyed nature and created invisible but life-threatening damage in it. Our first and foremost task was to find the people in these areas and to move them into healthy living spaces. First steps. Thanks to the networking and support of many people, the news spread quickly and the first flights could be organized. People in safe areas prepared for the arrival of their new community members, fixing up rooms, apartments, and houses, preparing meals, and decorating the streets. Trains, buses, and cars brought people from morning to night to all kinds of places where they were welcomed with open arms. I remember how most of them started to cry when they saw the decorated streets. The tension, the grief, the hopelessness. The anger, the hatred, everything they had endured for years, they had seen in their dreams too. And now that they were safe, the weight fell from their shoulders, right before our eyes. Still, they had to deal with the loss of their old homes and familiar environment. We gave them time to mourn the lost years and relieve their tired bodies of tension. We took them to their new homes, showed them everything they needed to know for the moment, and gave them time and peace. Some of them had already figured out where their skills were needed before they had even left their homes, and they wanted to start right away with helping to build the new world. The real work began, however, when the peace that had come with the dream slowly began to fade. Slowly, the scars from the old world, which turned out to be very fresh and deep wounds in some people, were clearly to be felt again. In the dream we had understood the true meaning of power. Power meant that the people were in their own power, that they could feel and direct their energy, that they could use their power to influence others, for better or worse. We had understood that our happiness was not to be found in things, but in ourselves only. The powerful of the new world were no longer those who possessed the most, but those who had found their way and wisdom within them. They used their networks to share their wisdom with people all over the world. They showed us that recognition and appreciation could boost our energy, but a healthy person did not need validation from others to be powerful. They showed that the suffering that had happened to countless people in the old world had almost always been caused by the striving for power and the illusory safety of individuals. We knew it were our invisible scars that had built the old world. They changed our energy, our thoughts, our behavior. People who had suppressed feelings in the old world, preventing them from feeling their energy clearly, understood the responsibility that they alone could bear. On the other side, people who had already set off to find their innermost selves in the old world finally found ways of feeling others that they had always longed for. They had found the most diverse ways and possibilities to free themselves from their limitations and fears. It was easy for them to settle into the new world, so they helped the people in their communities to deal with the changes that the new life brought. By bringing together people who understood how body, mind, or energy could be healed, and people who were willing to wander the path to their inner selves, the first healing centers were founded. As unique as the people were, as unique were the obstacles, crossroads, and pain they encountered on their path to themselves. Communities stood firm by their side and made it their mission to plant security where fears had caused infertility. In the beginning, letting go of old beliefs and bad habits was difficult for many people who were just learning to feel themselves again. But the more they practiced feelings instead of thinking, and letting go instead of letting their fears guide them, the more clearly they could see that the stories about energy reflected reality, and that they were in control of their energy, just like they were in their dreams. Some described it as warmth, others as tingling. Some spoke of feelings of happiness and satisfaction that shot through their bodies, and others that they had never felt true peace ever before. Community as a possibility of exchange, of one's own and others' growth, and of connection, once again, took on a fundamental importance for the coexistence of all. For the transition, even a system was developed that allowed communities to introduce themselves, their values and wisdom, their activities, their available food and soil. In this way, people and communities could find each other, so together they would become something greater. Through connecting the most diverse people with the most diverse experiences who shared the same longing for peace, even those with the deepest wounds understood that they were only human beings. No races, no borders, no stereotypes. Everyone his own universe. Every life valuable. Remains of the old world. The biggest global issues of the time were global warming and social inequality. A dissolution of social injustice was already underway, but to stop the human-caused climate change and to build a healthy world required the connection of many individuals. Due to the personal task that most people had yet to accomplish, a deep calm had set in. The means of transportation that could be seen on Earth and in the sky were only used to bring people to safe and healthy places, or to connect people who wanted to face the biggest problems from the old world together. Due to this abrupt change of life, fuel and food supplies would last for several years. These were to be used up until a sustainable concept for the production of food, materials and other necessary goods had been developed. It was not only necessary not to continue the pollution and environmental damage caused by the lifestyle of the few. We also had to undo some damage and help nature to regenerate and restore a natural balance. To the amazement of most of us, fully developed solutions already existed as to how this could be made possible. Technologies existed that could generate the electricity they needed by themselves, ready to replace a system that interfered with nature and become one that could even reverse some of the damage done by the old world. There were also plans and ideas on how these technologies could make people's homes healthy without losing their access to electricity. Many people offered their skills to help, and soon groups from a wide variety of backgrounds were coming together to clean soils, transform living spaces, breathe new life into old items, and create a beautiful atmosphere. Experts on agriculture, ecology, nutritional sciences, environmental sciences, biology, and many other fields quickly came together to search for solutions for healthy food, healthy soil, and healthy nature. They developed models that showed how different areas of the world would regenerate without human population and interference of industries on nature. In the old world we were used to destruction, but now we breathe more and more life into the new world. They identified areas where various plant species could grow naturally without the need for energy other than physical labor and without the use of additional water or chemicals. In their considerations, they made sure that the cultivation did not stand in the way of a return of the animal populations, and that it would be designed as close to nature as possible. Through their research, they were able to gather knowledge about which areas would recover by removing the existing industry in such a way that would allow the areas to be populated again in the near future. On that day, cheers were heard, and people who had been forced to leave their homes, with all their plants and animals, smells and special characteristics, began to dream of building new, old communities. For many materials, a wide variety of raw material recycling methods already existed, which had merely been shelved as non-profitable enough for the few. So, little by little, we began to break down all the industries that had been making us and our earth sick for decades. Where at first loud cheers were heard, soon loud curses arose, as the process was tedious and sometimes drove the people working in it almost to nervous breakdown. They now saw the interventions in nature with new eyes and could not understand how it could have come so far. In many places it was recognized that clustered research centers could offer many advantages, such as strengthening interdisciplinary cooperation and thus providing better and more future-oriented solutions. Within a very short time, research centers were set up all over the world to deal with a wide variety of problems. It was fascinating. By bundling competences, rapid progress could be made in the recovery of raw materials. The experts predicted that the existing reserves, including raw materials that could be extracted through deconstruction, would last for decades. Enough time to maintain vital infrastructure and industries for that moment while they continually search for alternatives. Also, global networking soon determined the best areas for cultivation and regeneration, which were reforested successive. People who came from former war zones and wanted to rebuild their old home were brought together with people who had useful knowledge and soon began their work. People worked tirelessly, and it was not long before nature found its rhythm again, and the first changes could be seen. Groundwater levels rose, and with them, plants and animals found their way back into areas that had been hostile to them for a long time. Animal populations increased, coral reefs and other seascapes regenerated. Our future. We had seen, indeed experienced in our own bodies, how humanity had almost ruined itself, completely lost in a web of power games. In the decades to come, many wise decisions would have to be made to ensure the survival of most creatures on Earth and to make their lives more livable. A solution had to be developed by which we could bring out the best in each individual and help them develop the skills we so desperately needed to build the new world. The initial time of human development should be characterized by community so that the children could collect as many impressions as possible. Since this allowed them to spend much of their time with people of different ages and backgrounds, their communication skills would develop naturally and independently, verbally as non-verbally. We wanted to encourage them to seek and strengthen all their skills, instead of losing them more and more with each year of life. Each evening, communities gathered to talk about the day, tell stories of past days, or just feel the presence of themselves and others. If there had been a conflict during the day, the whole community dealt with it, and by the end of the evening it had long become an old story with a moral message. Faith had been abused over and over again in the old world to achieve the goals of the powerful and the few. Under the cloak of an only true phrase, wars had been waged, religious communities had been eliminated, crimes had been justified. But the closer we looked at the different faiths of the old world, the clearer their parallels became to us. They were about love, community, and dealing with energy. They were about healing and wisdom. They tried to explain things that we couldn't see or touch, but could feel inside us. No one was hurt when their faith wasn't shared. It didn't matter what a person believed in. Their actions alone counted in the new world. Each person just believed in what they could feel in the depths of their heart, and each person respected that faith could be as unique as each of them was. There was only one thing that we all believed in, that we were deeply connected, and that our personal happiness was inseparable from the happiness of all life. For the children of the new world, we gathered lessons from ancient faith communities and incorporated them into the nightly ritual of storytelling. Their eyes sparkled when a particular story touched them, and once or twice I was allowed to witness how a young person had found their very own faith at the end of an evening. The children especially loved the stories of Santa Claus and other mythical creatures. They didn't understand how we could believe in these figures, as they couldn't be natural at all. What they did understand, however, were the lessons they could learn from most stories and myths. We also gained new wisdom from their lessons and understood that there were places in every faith where many people focused their energy on the same thing at the same time. We focused our energy on the future of our children. We taught them to find the wisdom within. The older they got, the more they were challenged to participate in the discussions and to train their formation of opinion. They were trained to conduct interpersonal relationships and to sharpen their compass for right and wrong. In their hearts grew goodness, compassion, understanding of their own weaknesses and those of others. It was beautiful because the youngest were so colorful, so diverse, so incredibly precious. They developed their skills much faster than we expected, and even though they were young, we could see how much they enjoyed contributing to the balance of the communities. It was not long before only children were born who never distrusted their energy, who instead, as nature had intended them to do, blindly followed it and got to know the world as the first humans had done. They understood that life was accompanied by inevitable loss, and the thought didn't cost them suffering. While we were still carrying scars of the old world, they already understood that death was part of the natural balance that connects all life. Some children discovered their love for nature, helping and playing on the fields, in the herb gardens and with the animals. Others built worlds of whatever they could find and discovered new horizons with the help of their energy and creativity. Their minds were free and ready for new challenges. It was about time for them to receive one of the most valuable tools that humankind had created globally. Being able to read and to write meant that they could be part of the global networking as well as access the infinite knowledge of the old world. And our children were driven by their energy. Once they mastered these skills, each child had to cut their own path until they found their destiny. The wandering children. They were to find clarity, wisdom, and peace on their path, like all the wanderers before them who had followed their energy and experienced the beauty of life. Always following their energy, they encountered communities where they could build their skills and strength, listen to their stories, and receive greater wisdom. They learned about the nature of new places and practiced rituals that people and communities used to increase their energy. They visited museums to marvel at treasures from ancient worlds, learned through stories of mistakes made in olden times, and were able to ask questions about the thoughts forming inside. When they came across a place that was being built or torn down, they could make themselves useful and find out what work their bodies could perform. They crossed healing centers and felt again and again the possibilities that lay in community, the conscious use of energy, and how these could even heal some things that were thought to be broken. They talked to lots of people and contributed with their own stories to looking at situations from different perspectives. They passed research centers and saw that in this world almost everything was possible. Like the wanderers before them, they met people to whom they felt a special connection and who helped them to focus and develop their skills. people who shared wisdom and experiences with them to help them increasing their potential. The stronger their bodies became and the clearer their thoughts, the more they understood and the happier they became. The more they understood, the clearer they could sense where their energy wanted to take them. After a few years, the young adults were aware of their strength, understood what kind of work they found meaning in, and what they needed to feel peace within themselves. And so they set out. Most stayed where they could feel themselves and their energy the most. Others were driven by their energy to specific people and places that made them feel the greatest happiness. They used their strength for the benefit of the communities living there. Some joined healing centers to enrich them with their new wisdom. Others visited schools of research centers to find out more about the processes in nature that had to be kept in balance. No matter which path they took, as long as they let their energy guide them, they knew they were following their destiny. Balance. It took only a few years, and the satellites from the old world showed us images of the new world in the most beautiful and vivid colors. We could see the stars again, as the people must have seen them who had lived before progress took away our view of the sky. The smells of nature returned and left us enchanted day after day. We no longer thought about all the things we had possessed in the old world, but we saw the beauty that we regained. We no longer lived where we were born, but where we felt most alive. We led happy and content lives, enjoyed the beauty of nature, experienced community, and did the work we felt was our calling. No one had to tell us what to do or what our duties were, nor did we have to think about them. We didn't need rules or laws. We just followed our energy, our wisdom. If we weren't happy anymore, or if our energy became restless, we let it take us to new places, to places that gave us everything we needed. We had found our paradise, a world that could give us the greatest energy, a world where we could find peace. I took a deep breath, holding the air in my lungs for a moment, and releasing it with the tension that had been building in my body over the last few hours. Fresh air, not just on the coast or in the deepest forests. It was everywhere now. My face had been turned toward the fire for some time, and I felt its warmth. Like every time I told the story of the old world and the new, I felt my scars from the long-forgotten days. They had faded and no longer hurt, but I was glad I could still recognize them. When I was finally able to clear my thoughts, I looked into the dreamy and curious eyes of the wandering children. I was an old woman, and so, over the course of my life, countless wandering children had come to me to listen to my story. And like all those who had come before them, and all those who would come after them, I asked each and every one of them the one question, the only question that really interested me. Do you already know where your energy is taking you? Last words. The happiest memories of my early life are the ones where I was told stories that made me dream. Most of the time my grandfather took over this role, and he was a very good storyteller. He created dreams and fantasies that we wandered together, and I learned many things on our travels. Things about myself, my siblings and other kids. Things about my parents and the world. There always was a deeper meaning to his stories for me to find and explore, to train my compass for right and wrong. My grandfather had, like many others, experienced the injustices of this world firsthand, had struggled through pain and fear, and chose love. He taught me so much about the world and its people. It hurts to admit that despite all his efforts, I wandered in complete darkness for many years of my life. Even more that I can never hold him in my arms and tell him that I found my energy and that I have been following it since that day. But knowing that it was him and my family who made it possible for me to get lost much later than other kids did in this fast-paced world fills me with gratitude. My grandfather told his stories because he dreamt I would never lose myself. I tell my story as I dream that one day no one will have to lose themselves. This story is a story I would love to tell my children and their children someday. My story contains reality and dream. We won't miraculously fall into a dream one day that helps us tear down our limitations and find the reality behind many truths. We must face the anger, hate, greed, fear, pain, cultural limitations, and insecurities. We don't have to do it alone. There is so much wisdom and healing possibility in this world. But we have to want balance. What we really need to survive is water and food, shelter, and contact with people we feel connected to. The structures in which we live demand ever higher prices for this. What we really need to survive is understanding of our energy and creating balance. The structures in which we live block both. We're desperately looking for protectors, while they are mostly powerful to find. In reality, neither countries nor laws exist. Only nature and its creatures, which have been placed in borders and chains by a few, and are kept in these in the most diverse ways. There are no differences between people, only people with different experiences in the world, knowledge, love, security, fear, and pain. But despite all the obstacles, many people have already created more balance within themselves and others, bringing light and warmth into this cruel world. I listened to their words and music. I felt their energy and saw their actions. I marveled at their ideas and found hope in them. They are wanderers who, despite the injustices, are not willing to give up their hopes for a better world. The more wanderers connect, the better we can understand the needs of nature and help it and all its life to regain a balance. I am a wanderer. I am a dreamer. I deeply believe that dreams are nothing more than potential revealing itself to us quite openly, showing us what kinds of wonder we can create by controlling and connecting our energy. I dream of us finding opportunities in places where truth only shows us risks and try to stir up fears. I dream of us using the limitless knowledge that humanity has acquired over thousands of years. I dream that someday we will do what we were always meant to, living, growing, and, like everything in nature, constantly evolving. I dream that we take from nature what we need to do so and give back what no longer serves us. I dream of communities that support each other and face life's tasks together, that carry each other and create space for growth. I dream of balance. I dream of peace. I dream about dreaming people. If we keep treating symptoms instead of fighting the cause, the world will die, and we will die with it. Not tomorrow, not the day after tomorrow, but a little more, day by day. Even after thousands of years, we can still choose to find balance. We are one world, inseparably connected to all life, consciously or unconsciously.